Welcome to the flagship program of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Middle East Alert. This is a cooperative program between IDC International Radio and the JCPA, and we are here with a very distinguished a panel on a very important topic today. And the topic is the stealth intifada, the roots of the new Palestinian terror campaign, and the first 100 days. We're going to be analyzing what is the role of the incitement to terror that we have seen in the past years, but has taken a new turn. We're here with, as I said before, three distinguished guests. Hersh Goodman, the former main editor and publisher of the Jerusalem Report, and a longtime well-known international journalist here in Israel. Welcome, Hersh. Dr. Ambassador Alan Baker, former ambassador to Canada and the former legal advisor to Israel's foreign ministry. Welcome, Ambassador, to the flagship program of Middle East Alert. And Brigadier General Yossi Cooper-Wasser, the former number 2 man in the IDF intelligence division. He was the head of intelligence assessment, and then more recently he was the Director General of the Office for Strategic Affairs in the Netanyahu coalition. Welcome, Brigadier General Cooper-Wasser. We are discussing something no less significant today, gentlemen, than terror itself. Hersh Goodman, the editor and main writer of this latest Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs publication called The Stealth Intifada.
Not really, but anyway.
Well, it's part of the...
we don't recognize it as an intifada. We recognize it as a wave of terror. We don't like to label it as an intifada yet. So we actually called it the New Palestinian Uprising, the first 100 days, October 50 to January 16.
But your investigation, Hersh Goodman, of incitement is a central theme, a central role and thesis of this book. What is unique about the role of incitement in this? The word stealth was used. I mean, there's something hidden.
Yes, there is stealth. We did use that word. There's been a lot of debate over the work, which is indicative of the fact that we don't fully understand it. But what's happened here is that it's gone beyond incitement. It is now social media driving a terror campaign of individuals with no clear organizational affiliation, but it's also, in parallel, the Palestinian Authority using buttons like the Jews are conquering Al-Aqsa, they're murdering our children in the streets. So there are two parallel things going on here. One is the Palestinian Authority in a very subtle way when it suits them because of internal problems, because of their relations with Hamas, because the President of the United States didn't mention them at the UN. A whole lot of reasons. The PA plays this on and off, inciting people. But the real problem is what's coming over social media and leading young people to pick up a knife and go stab a Jew, and with no organizational affiliation. So it's a very different situation to the one we've had before, and that's why we've looked at it so seriously.
You know, Brigadier General Cooper-Wasser, in your decades in the Israeli intelligence apparatus, and then more recently as the person really who was responsible for coordinating all of the government efforts against the incitement to terror and to murder of the Palestinian Authority, it has been, if I'm not mistaken, somewhat of an uphill battle for you in order to create awareness over the strategic problem that incitement to terrorism creates. And here, Hersh Goodman, a longtime and very public advocate of strong relations with the Palestinian Authority, is now turned and said, well, wait a second, there's a target here. It's not only a target, there's a source of incitement. It's the Palestinian Authority. What's your sense of it today?
I think that what we are seeing today is the result of the ongoing effort of the Palestinian Authority and other organizations within the Palestinian community to inculcate in the Palestinian mind a set of elements that comprise the Palestinian, I would say, psychological infrastructure. And this has been an ongoing effort for a long time that was used time and again in order to prepare the ground for terror campaigns. Previous terror campaigns were eventually activated in different manners. You know, and if you look at the first Intifada, it was very similar to what is happening right now.
Right.
Again, it was not very well organized. There was some organization, but it was pretty loose. And most of the people acted out of their conviction that this is what is expected of them. In the second Intifada, it was a little bit more organized, in the sense that most operations were carried out by organizations that were taking part in a very robust channel of preparations that eventually led to a terror attack. Now, with every Palestinian carrying in the back of his mind those pillars of consciousness that make him ready to carry out an attack against the Jews, they don't need much more than just a wink from somebody on the top saying, now this is what we expect you to do. And what they expect them to do right now, and this is being said by the leadership of the Palestinians, what we expect you to do right now is popular resistance. That's how they call it. Or popular, peaceful, they call it sometimes peaceful or in peaceful manners resistance. Which means don't use firearms. Just use weapons that are not exploding or making noise. Stab the Jews. Drive over the Jews. These are the things we expect you to do, and we call them popular resistance. And all Palestinians understand exactly what this means. And when they hear Abu Mazen and others telling them, we have to prevent the Jews from defiling the Al-Aqsa Mosque in all means, and for that purpose we need to use a popular resistance, they know what they're expected to do. So you have the high temperature in this spot kept by the ongoing incitement. It's ready to boil at any given time. And once somebody in the top tells them, now it's the time to move, then you start to see the boiling. And the boiling, by using this term of popular resistance, they make sure that it doesn't overflow the situation, and that you don't go to rocket attacks and suicide explosives and suicide attacks and things like that. The other thing that's, in my mind, interesting in this respect is how do you know that somebody is going to, can you make sure that somebody will actually go and stab? Maybe everybody will look at the other guy and say, maybe you'll go and stab, not me. And I feel like it is like you put a popcorn in the microwave. You know that most seeds of the corn are going to explode. You never know who's going to explode on minute and 20 seconds, and who's going to explode after 3 minutes. And there are always some who never explode and ruin the popcorn. But that's the situation right here, with the pressure, with the heat, with the encouragement from the everybody around. All the entire public is supporting it, with the encouragement from the leadership. More and more popcorn seeds are exploding and going to stab a Jew, because this is what is expected for them according to their psychological infrastructure, in order to be real Palestinians, in order to participate in the war against Zionism. This is what is expected from them, and they're doing.
Well, you know, General Cooper-Wasser and Hersh Goodman, to hear your two assessments of the popcorn of incitement to terror linkage offered to us in this studio stands in very sharp opposition to many people who are watching the popcorn analogy from abroad, Ambassador Baker, and they're saying, no, it's not because of ideological roots on the ground. It's not because of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's because there's what they call this unfinished business called the failed Palestinian-Israeli peace process, and the frustrations of these young people, these lone wolf attacks. That seems to be and by the way, that's being reflected by the White House and in other capitals in Europe, Ambassador Baker,
and by the Secretary General of the UN.
And
so.
Help us understand this complete disconnect between what professional assessments are. This is a professional panel. This is not a political panel. And what professional and political assessments are in the United States and abroad.
Look, I think there are two elements. Clearly, this is a classical situation of incitement through social media.
Right.
And this is actually what's happening on the ground. Regrettably, international law lags behind realities, and international law doesn't know what social media is. It doesn't know what the internet is. And whilst once incitement meant somebody standing on Hyde Park corner and making a speech, or somebody in a mosque preaching to the believers. International law doesn't know that now it's possible at the press of a button to incite millions and millions of people without really having to make very, very serious efforts. And so this is the reality. Tragically also, because of the very vague border between freedom of speech and incitement, a lot of jurisdictions, including the United States and the issue of the First Amendment rights to freedom of speech, they hesitate to criminalize incitement, because Congress will always claim that one has to guard the freedom of speech. And so there's no international treaty criminalizing incitement. There are 20, 30 international treaties criminalizing various types of terrorism: maritime, aviation terrorism, nuclear terrorism, economic terrorism, and what have you. But there's no international treaty criminalizing terrorism. Now, the international community is trying to find its justification, or is trying to understand how come this wave of incitement and this wave of violence. And they're trying simply to explain it by frustration or whatever, which really is, in my opinion, is completely artificial and false.
You know,
I'd like to take it a bit further. I'd like to say what we have is a culture of death, worship of death. You know, one of the basic Jewish things is that saving a life is above everything else. And I come from the other side of the political spectrum, and what I've learned now is that these kids have been led to believe that they'll have a better life in the world to come as shahidim than they do on this earth. And it's that type of culture where dying ain't all that bad because it's going to be better than you on this earth. The other thing is, what I noticed in looking, we've done a compilation of all the attacks, who did them, where they came from. There are three, I wouldn't say organizations, but three strands that tied them together. A lot of the people who carried out the attacks are troubled. You got problems, you troubled, there's 36-year-old guys who are getting divorced and owe money. There's an 18-year-old girl whose husband, she was going to get married and she was dumped the day before. There was somebody caught having an affair. The way to be a shaheed is to do this. So it's a combination of very malicious social media and knowing how to motivate people who think it's going to be better on the other side. And it's only going to be better on the other side if you become a shaheed, a martyr, and take somebody with you. And it's very clever and it's very smart.
Hersh Goodman, you're talking about religiously motivated incitement here. If you're talking about the Martyr, 72 Visions, the Quran, you look at the Al-Aqsa, incitement around Al-Aqsa, there seems to be a very strong religious Islamic theme going on to this type of incitement. ISIS as a role model for these young people. General Cooper, what's your sense?
There's definitely a common denominator between what's happening here and the things done by ISIS. First of all, both of them are fighting against what they consider to be the attempt of the Western culture to infiltrate into the Middle East.
Right.
So ISIS fights against Western culture that is coming to the Middle East through supporters of the West in the Middle East, the local pragmatists in the Middle East, and it fights against the presence of the West in the Middle East and trying to kick it out. In all places, besides Israel. Israel is a place where the Palestinians have to fight against the Western presence, and they are doing it. And they're doing it on the basis of a combination of religious and national elements, because for them, there's no differentiation between the two. Both of them are good reasons to fight against the presence of the Jews here, and definitely against the presence of the Jews in places near Muslim holy places like Al-Aqsa. So this is a common denominator. But on top of that, this logic of dying in favor of religious or national cause in this context is being totally superior to any other idea, because this is the purpose of life. The purpose of life is to make it significant, make it valuable by doing something in order to kick the West out of here, or in this context, to kick the Jews out of it. And this is why all these youngsters are under pressure to make their life valuable, to make their life worthy by carrying out an attack. And this is what they're doing. This is why everybody is celebrating when somebody is committing a terror attack. And even if they get killed during the attack, everybody is celebrating. This is a reason for a celebration. This is very strange. For us Westerners, for them it's very, very obvious. The other thing that, you mentioned the religious logic behind it. Now, if you look at the placards prepared to celebrate the death of these guys, they're always using all kinds of verses from the Quran in order to justify it. Now, all the verses they use, for example, if they use the verses from the second chapter of the Quran, verse number 169, very famous, don't consider those who died in the name of Allah dead because they are alive and the Lord is taking care of their needs. And if they use the other verse, number 39 in chapter 22 of the Quran, which speaks about the permission given to fight against those who fight the believers and so on and so forth. All these verses are verses that in the Quran are related to a regular war. They came down in the context of the Uhud war. Here, there's a way of distorting the Islam itself by using these verses in order to justify killing innocent people, children. It's unbelievable. Most Muslims should have been appalled by that interpretation of Islam. But what you see is that everybody is afraid of saying anything, and actually they use these verses in order to justify something that's totally unacceptable even by most Muslims. Very strange and very dangerous, and gives a religious dimension to this terror campaign.
This religious dimension, Ambassador Baker, does not wash in the West nearly as it can be discussed in the center of Western religion and civilization, right here in Jerusalem. Frankly, as a former ambassador to Canada and a decades-long diplomat with the Foreign Service here in Israel, what is it, in your view, about the way the West is looking at our region, at the Middle East, that makes it very difficult to present a notion that religiously motivated incitement to murder and religiously motivated terror is actually an important data point in what's going on here?
The West seems to have, throughout history, they've always had some type of glorified viewpoint of the Middle East, of Arabia. And so they look at this in a different way, and they don't address their own values to what happens here. So you have a series of double standards. What's happening here in this area, it's okay, it's Arabia, this is what's to be expected. This, of course, wouldn't happen in our own countries because we have different values. And unfortunately, they therefore excuse what's happening here, and they tend to close a blind eye to the seriousness of what's happening. Now, there are two ways of dealing with this. One way is actually on the ground by ensuring that the religious leaders and the political leaders will call upon the public to carry out these acts, and this would be the only way of influencing the local public. In other words, stopping the incitement from the religious and political sources. The second way of dealing with it, principally in the international community, is to have the international community draft an international convention against incitement to violence and terror. At the Jerusalem Center, we have drafted an international convention which tries to bring international law up to date to meet the present challenges. And we've submitted this, and we even presented it in the United Nations in New York. Nothing has happened with it, and it's probably high time. And I think now that the international community and the Europeans are feeling to a larger extent the problems as a result of what's happening here in the Middle East, maybe there would be an openness to consider more seriously adopting this type of international convention and criminalizing incitement.
Hirsch, your sense of the West?
Look, first of all, a lot of the perpetrators are children. And automatically, you see a child doing an act like this, you say he's got a reason, it must be for some higher authority. So there's not a lot of empathy for the victims here. The perpetrators, the children who are getting killed doing this, are seen as the victims, and not the victims who are getting attacked by the terrorists.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Many of them,
And,
by the way...
and by the way, it's not by the by, it's thought out. It's thought out. In other words, sorry, I didn't mean to.
I was just going to affirm your point. A senior Israeli police commander said just the other day that the vast majority of these 131 terror attacks that have taken place since October of 2015 till today in February 2016 have been between the ages of 12 and 25.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say. Or 36 and 38, the guy driving his car into a bunch of people at a bus stop because he's had an argument with his wife. So even though there's no organizational structure, there's a conceptual structure here that are sending these people out. And you can't put your finger on it very, very clearly. The other thing is, once upon a time, the Intifada was against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. It had a goal. Now the attacks are in Ra'anana, Ramatayim, Netanya, Beersheba. It's no longer against the occupation. It's like Yossi said, it's against the Jewish presence here. And it's interesting, nowhere have I seen the word Israel. It's always Yahud. It's always against the Jews. It's not against Israel per se. And I think that's also a very important point, because there's a smacking of anti-Semitism here. Jews who in the social media that we did the research on, Jews abusing Arab women, Jews abusing holy sites.
Those are the charges. Those are the incitement charges.
This is what's coming across. The one girl picked up a knife, I think on the 1st of October. This is how it all started. And it's filmed. She walks over to a checkpoint with their soldiers standing. They totally relaxed, we see. Suddenly she pulls out a knife, stabs him. The night before, her husband-to-be had told her that the wedding is off. In other words, they sent this woman with a knife and filmed it and then posted it. And she's become a big hero in this whole thing.
She, by the way, a woman by the name of Hadil al-Hashlamun, who wore a niqab. She wore a traditional Muslim dress, religious dress.
She got on, she put on, all you could see were her eyes. And now the street's named after her and so on and so forth. So there is an organization. Suddenly every person who dies, a little child appears before the Kaaba with the name of the martyr. And so there's somebody doing this. It's not happening out of the blue, but it's not this organization or that organization. In terms of intelligence, it's not having to get a suicide belt and getting the bombs and getting the connection. And it's different. It's totally different. And I don't think the world has fully comprehended it.
Let me just go to General Kuprasser for a moment, sir. I am aware that in the Office for Strategic Affairs, where you were the Director General for 5 years, I believe, they were discussing what was revealed in this research led by Hirsch Goodman
And Yossi.
and Yossi, the two, and all of you, and all three of you were right, which is to say that the 6th Fatah conference that was held in Bethlehem in 2009 was this is the first time in my understanding that any academic or policy institute or think tank has actually raised that issue. That was very much the intellectual and ideological source
of Fatah.
For Fatah and the Fatah-ruled PA for this type of incitement. Help us understand what was the meaning of that conference that was held in Bethlehem in 2009 as with regard to the current incitement to terror that we see today.
Well, this conference was held after the efforts to reach some agreement between Israelis and Palestinians failed after the attempt to do so in the days of former Prime Minister Olmert. And after that, when the Palestinians realized that actually in any negotiations, they are going to be asked to accept in one way or another, that doesn't matter how you phrase it, in one way or another, they would have to accept that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. And once they realize that this is demanded from them one way or another, they decided that going through negotiations is the wrong direction. And instead of that, they have decided to embark on a way of unilateral activities, politically in the diplomatic sphere, in the international diplomatic sphere. And in order to be successful there, in order to put pressure on Israel, this should be accompanied by what they termed, as I said, the popular resistance, which is terrorism without firearms. And this grand strategy was designed and was accepted in the sixth conference of the Fatah back in 2009 in Bethlehem. This was where it all started. From there on, for now it's like 7 years, actually 6.5 years, that they implement this policy. Twice during this period, they were forced to join some kind of negotiations. Once during the days of Senator Mitchell and Secretary Clinton, and once under Secretary Kerry. In both cases, they came to the negotiations just in order to be there, without any intention to really to make any progress, knowing that they would have to do something about accepting Israel's identity as a Jewish state, which they totally refused to accept. And because what the West, coming back to what the question you asked about, what the West doesn't understand and doesn't want to understand, and deliberately insist on not understanding, is that we are still in the battle about the right of the Jews to have a state of their own in any piece of what the Palestinians call Palestine, what the Israelis, what Jews call Eretz Israel. This is still the core of the conflict. It's not about where the line is going to be that will divide the two states. This is an easy issue. The question is whether the Palestinians are ever going to accept Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. And right now they're saying not only no, but we have a lot of reasons why this is totally unacceptable. And our mission in life is to make sure that it's not going to happen.
You know, General Kupwasser, it's not only you who's asking the question about whether the Palestinian Authority was accepting Israel's existence as a nation state of the Jewish people as opposed to a border conflict. It was actually Professor Bernard Lewis who made this comment that was picked up by our defense minister, Minister Ya'alon, and Professor Lewis, probably the greatest living authority in the West on the Middle East, made this comment in an article back in 2009 after the failure of the Olmert brokered Annapolis process. I want to ask you, Ambassador Baker, let's move the spotlight away from the West for a moment and let's turn it on to Israel. Because here we are in 2016. The Sixth Fatah Conference that General Kupwasser just, about which he gave us an important explication, was in 2009. 7 years, this information was available to Israeli government officials and to the Israeli media and to the Israeli political class and to NGOs, et cetera. And they haven't done that. There has not been all that much done in Israel about this in terms of legislation as well. And just to end this rather long-winded question, the recent counterterrorism legislation that is now in the Knesset does not include very much at all, if anything, any mention on incitement to terrorism.
Because, as I said, the problem of incitement is that it borders on the issue of freedom of speech. And in any legislative forum, whether it's in Israel or in the United States or in Europe, there'll always be those elements who will claim, well, you can't limit, if you're a true democracy, you can't limit the freedom of people to speak. And here in Israel, I think the president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Chief Justice Barak, said that in Israel we have to fight terror with one hand behind our back. And we have to, on the one hand, honor basic humanitarian norms, but on the other hand, we have to fight terror in a very serious manner. And no other state really is facing this dilemma. But even in Israel, we've hesitated before legislating any type of limitations on freedom of speech, always with the hope that maybe it will be possible to push forward the peace process. And we're all interested in this because we all have children who serve in the army, and we're all living on a day-to-day basis in an atmosphere which includes instances of terror. And so we always live in the hope that this wave will end and we can get back to a serious mode of negotiations, which doesn't necessarily go together with what General Kupavas has said regarding the true intention of the basic Islamic elements, that the Jews have got no place here. And this is something that we've been for years trying to find a way of solving this.
Hersh Goodman.
Yeah, I would just say this, that first of all, I'm very much against limiting freedom of speech. One man's incitement is another man's point of view.
Here you are.
And I'm a journalist, even though I've been in think tank community for 15 years. I believe in freedom of thought. But sometimes you can't put your finger on it. If you're going to cite a verse like Yossi said from the Quran, it gives a message to the Palestinians that not you, not I can understand. It's a subtle little message. And where do you put the parameters on this? What I think is really important to explain is that the attitude of the youngsters carrying out this new wave of uprising is not different from Iran. They see Israel as a cancer, as a Western foothold in Arabia, exactly what was said before. And therefore, they don't want to accept this Western foothold that's going to rape Al-Aqsa, etc., etc. But there's another thing here, Dan, and this is important. Syria's up in flames. Iraq up in flames. Libya down the tubes. The whole Arab world is in turmoil. American president gives a speech. He doesn't even mention Palestine. A few days later, suddenly the PA, the Jews are raping Al-Aqsa. Everybody up on their hind legs, and so on and so forth. And by the way, we ourselves guilty of giving them the ability to make that charge.
So what you're saying, wait, Hersh Goodman, what I think you're saying here is that incitement to terrorism on sanctioned by the Palestinian Authority and carried out by these young people is a way of putting the Palestinian issue back on center stage.
You've got it, exactly. Because of what's going on internationally, their issue had been forgotten. So after the president addresses the UN in October it was, suddenly Al-Aqsa becomes an issue. Then Al-Aqsa dies down because everybody sees we're not burning Al-Aqsa. Suddenly we're murdering these children in the streets and putting knives next to their hands, claiming that they were going to stab people. So it's all very sophisticated. You ask why nothing's been done since 2009. That's not true, because their path was the International Criminal Court, get Israel and everything it does. BDS, boycott Israel. There was an international campaign to demonize Israel. And this is an outgrowth of that. Abu Mazen says, I don't believe in violence. I haven't heard one condemnation. Not one condemnation of the violence we've had to live with here. And it's not violence that we've got a missile against. It's not violence we've got intelligence against. It's not violence that we can control and fully understand. But they can. They can. The Palestinian Authority can say, stop this now. It's not good for anyone.
Yeah,
Not one word.
This actually brings us, transitions us to a larger point, and that is that I want our listeners to know that what the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs has been doing is really to bring to the fore not only the military aspects of terrorism, but also the non-military aspects, the concept of delegitimization, demonization, BDS as an operational arm, as you've put it, Hersh Goodman, of this, and incitement, international law that Attorney Baker is in charge of the JCPOA's entire international law program in the context of all of this non-military terrorism, and essentially what you're talking about. And of course, General Kuperwasser is in charge of this rather sometimes under-noticed area in Israel and abroad, which are these new alliances in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors, which is another discussion which we're going to have here on Middle East Alert. But you're really making a larger macro point about what the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs does. Now, in our final couple minutes, I want to, in our flagship program, gentlemen, ask each of you the bottom line burning question, your view, General Kuperwasser, what is the most troubling, frightening aspect of the Middle East, and then what is the most positive aspect you see? Let's start with the most difficult aspect you see right now in the Middle East that is burning, as Hersh Goodman says, not only with terror, but with incitement.
Well, I believe that the most troubling thing that's happening in the Middle East is that the West has given up on the Middle East. The West has given up on trying to help the pragmatists of the Middle East. It's backing off. It prefers to deal with the immigration of these pragmatists to the West rather than taking the necessary steps in order to encourage them to stay in the Middle East. And this is reflected first and foremost in the nuclear deal with Iran, that was perceived by everybody in the Middle East as a decision by the West to give the control of the Middle East to the Iranians. And we see everything that happened afterwards. Actually, the Iranians didn't do it all by themselves. They joined hands with the Russians, and they are now shaping the Middle East in their terms. And the West is actually just watching from the veranda.
How about a point of light? A point of light in all this darkness.
The point of light in this is that, first of all, Israel is strong enough to defend itself. So we are able to withstand the negative impact of this development, although it's going to cost us a lot of money to defend ourselves, a lot of money to have the necessary intelligence to defend ourselves as well. It's not going to be easy. And the other point is that since we are here and we are here to stay, and everybody in this region understands it, I believe there's a growing incentive for pragmatists in the Middle East, totally frustrated with the West, to become closer friends of Israel. And we see it with Egypt, we see it with Jordan, we see it underneath the surface also with other elements in the Middle East. So this is a positive term. It may even have some positive impact in the future on the Palestinian issue, maybe. But and the other thing in this respect is that the more it is hitting the West, this incitement is also becoming a problem for the West. There's a growing chance, as Alan said, that some people are going to wake up. And you just saw Chancellor Merkel 2 days ago saying, well, I understand that we cannot move a lot on the Palestinian issue. And people understand that with these positions of the Palestinians, progress cannot take place, and what needs to be done is to change the Western attitude to the issue in general and to the Palestinian problem in particular, and then maybe something is going to happen. But this is
what General Kuperwasser says. Maybe one of the most positive things to happen recently is that Chancellor Angela Merkel says this is not the time for a Palestinian-Israeli agreement. Ambassador Baker, what is the most difficult thing for you happening here?
Well, for me, the fact is that we have a legal framework. We have agreements with the Palestinians, which are still very much valid. But the Palestinian Authority hasn't got the capability of returning to a negotiating mode because they're at loggerheads with Hamas. Hamas will never allow them to come back to negotiations. So when you hear the Secretary General of the UN or the Secretary of State of the United States or the Foreign Affairs head of the EU calling upon Israel to return to negotiation with the Palestinians, it's just an amazing element of naivety on their part that they don't realize that this can't happen as long as the head of the Palestinian Authority doesn't have the credibility or the authority to return to any negotiating
or the intention.
Or the intention.
According to his foreign minister, Riyad Malki just said we'll never go back to negotiations.
And so what do? They're trying to bypass any negotiating mode by going to the United Nations, by going to the International Criminal Court, by trying to bring about pressures to use the foreign minister of France to pressurize Israel into basically accepting what they consider to be their demands for the outcome of any negotiation.
And a positive point of, is there a point of light here?
Well, I think I can only agree with General Kuperwasser that Israel is strong, and we're basing ourselves on a very moral argument. And I think the international community is slowly realizing, especially when they've got this huge wave of refugees coming into them, they're realizing that they can't sit on the side and naively cast aspersions and accuse Israel when now they're actually far more involved. So hopefully they'll come to this realization, hopefully sooner than later.
Hirsch Goodman, in putting together this tome of this work, which is going to be available both in print and online at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs website. That's jcpa.org, and you can find it. You'll be able to find it shortly, right? It's supposed to be issued in the next couple of weeks. Yeah. Help us understand, what was the most troubling data point that you learned in doing all this research?
Okay, for me the most troubling thing is the hatred for Israel and for Jews that I see in schools, in the media, social media. It's like unbelievable. We don't teach our children to hate. And I'm very, very concerned by the indelible scar of perennial incitement against Israel is leaving on 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds who speak about the Jews in a way that I haven't heard since, and I wasn't around in 1940, but that hasn't been heard since. A real hatred. So it makes it very difficult to see that generation negotiating with. On the other side, what I see as a very positive point is that 75% of Israelis have been born here. Hebrew is their language. They joke in Hebrew, they got slang in Hebrew. They're born here, they haven't come with the baggage of new immigrants. This is their country, they will know how to defend it, and ultimately they'll know how to negotiate with the Palestinians. The good news is 98% of the Palestinians are literate. We're not dealing with people in trees. The problem is we've been dealing with a terrible leadership. People tell us to go to negotiate. You've got to speak to them sometime over and over again. Speak to who? Speak to who? Who am I supposed to negotiate with there? It's a dyslexic society. Hamas, PA, Fatah, we're supposed to have elections, no elections, same leadership in power, led by an 80-year-old man with no vision, no future in sight. I sort of agree with Ban Ki-moon. These people are frustrated, but not because of us. If they changed the cassette, they would see us as a blessing, arid agriculture, medicine, whatever you want. We could live together and work together and make this place great. But the hatred on the one side and the attitude of the international community that encourages him, and the failure of leadership on the Palestinian side to challenge us, not by terror, we'll beat them in terror, challenge us with peace. But there hasn't been a single Palestinian leader who's prepared to say, I'm prepared to live in what we consider 63% of Palestine, gone to the Jews. So it's a failure of leadership on their side, in my opinion.
Well, on that note, I think we all should wish for ourselves when we turn 80 that we'll have the right vision.
Hey, that's next year. No, I'm
when this
joking.
panel turns 80 in the coming years, that we'll have the vision to continue to defend Israel, to defend freedom in the Middle East, and to hope and work for peace. Gentlemen, thank you very much for this very insightful and in-depth flagship program of Middle East Alert. And this is in cooperation with the IDC International Radio, and we'll look forward to discussing all of the critical and dramatic developments in each of your areas at the Jerusalem Center. As we continue this podcast series every couple of weeks, we'll be sending it directly to our listeners, and you can also get it off the Jerusalem Center website. That's jcpa.org. You can also get it off the IDC International Radio website. And we're really will be delighted to see you again. Everyone here, of course, senior directors and analysts at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. This has been Dan Diker, fellow at the Jerusalem Center and head of its Political Warfare Project. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again real soon.